It began with the sound of static, a low, uneven hiss, followed by a stuttering rhythm of clicks, like rain on glass. At the wireless interception station in Buckinghamshire, the night shift was supposed to be quiet. Operators smoked in silence, eyes fixed on the spools of paper slowly feeding through teleprinters. Outside, the English countryside slept under a sky without stars. Inside, a young signals officer named Jerry Roberts rubbed his eyes, stared at the endless stream of letters punching out of the machine, and frowned. 4,000 characters, he murmured. All gibberish. The message had come in just before midnight on August 11th, 1941. It was longer than anything they'd seen before. No spaces, no repetitions, no sense. A solid wall of letters, perfectly random. And yet, one of the senior officers, leaning over Jerry's shoulder, whispered, "This is gold." They didn't know it yet, but what they'd captured was a message from Hitler's own command network, a cipher so complex that the Germans believed it to be unbreakable. The machine that produced it was called the Lorenz SC-40, though no one at Bletchley Park knew that name yet. To the intercept operators, it was simply tunny. The system was reserved for the highest levels of the Nazi hierarchy, communications between Berlin and field commanders, between the Führer and his generals. Unlike Enigma, which used rotors and switches, this code was generated by a teleprinter system that mixed letters with a stream of pseudo-random bits. It was elegant, fast, and invisible to anyone without the matching machine. To break it was thought impossible. But that night, something had gone wrong. Somewhere deep in occupied Europe, a German operator, tired, impatient, perhaps under bombardment, had made a small, human mistake. He'd sent the same message twice, with only slight variations, using the same encryption key. The error created a pattern, a tiny window through which the British could glimpse the structure of the code. It was, as one cryptanalyst later said, like finding the heartbeat of a ghost. When the transcripts arrived at Bletchley Park the next morning, the atmosphere shifted. Normally, the analysts' huts buzzed with chatter and the tapping of typewriters. That day, the air was tense, the silence thick enough to touch. Cigarette smoke hung in blue clouds above rows of wooden desks. Every scrap of paper was precious, every sequence of letters a possible clue. The message itself was nonsense, a jumble of letters, ABCD, LMNO, WXYZ, without pattern or meaning. But to mathematicians like Bill Tutte, it wasn't nonsense. It was a puzzle written in a language no one yet understood. Tutte was 24, quiet, and painfully shy. He'd been a chemistry student before the war. Numbers, not people, were his world. When his commanding officer handed him the intercepted messages, Tutte didn't see chaos. He saw structure hiding beneath it, like a melody beneath noise. "I stared at it for hours," he later wrote. "At first it looked random. But no man-made system is truly random." Days turned into weeks. The analysts filled blackboards with equations, charted letter frequencies, counted intervals. Somewhere, Tutte began to suspect that this cipher wasn't like Enigma at all. It wasn't mechanical in the same way, it was mathematical. That made it both terrifying and beautiful. Late one night, Tutte stayed behind after everyone else had gone. The rain drummed against the tin roof. He looked at the pages of code spread before him and started marking pairs of letters, tracing patterns through the noise. Slowly, something emerged, a rhythm, a pattern of repeating intervals that shouldn't have existed. He leaned back, heart pounding. "Whoever built this," he whispered, "built a monster." The next morning, Tutte presented his findings to his supervisor. What he had uncovered was the logical skeleton of the Lorenz cipher, a 12-wheel system that produced billions of combinations. It wasn't just a code, it was a machine disguised as mathematics. For the first time, Bletchley Park realized they weren't up against a mechanical device like Enigma, but something far more sophisticated, something built to outthink the human brain. The codebreakers named it Tunny, after the slippery Atlantic fish. Hard to catch, harder to keep. To break it, they would need more than pencils and notebooks. They would need something new, something faster than any human mind. In one memo written that week, a senior officer scribbled a single line. "To defeat this, we require not a man, but a machine." No one laughed. Not this time. The teleprinters in Hut 6 clattered through the night, spewing more and more encrypted messages. The Germans kept transmitting orders, reports, logistics, all written in the language of Tunny. And with every message, the stakes grew higher. The analysts smoked until their throats burned. The windows rattled with the distant hum of air raids. And in a dimly lit corner of Bletchley Park, a quiet young mathematician stared at a wall of numbers, knowing that somewhere inside that chaos lay the plans of an empire. He wasn't sure how yet, but he knew one thing. If they could read these messages, they could read the mind of Hitler himself. And that realization hit them like a chill wind through the room. Because to do it, to unlock that code, they would have to invent something the world had never seen before, something that could think. And once they built it, nothing about war or humanity would ever be the same again. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. He arrived without fanfare. Just another engineer in a crumpled coat, his shoes still dusty from London streets. Thomas Harold Flowers, 40 years old, quiet and methodical, stepped into the hut at Bletchley Park and stopped short. The room was chaos. Rolls of punched tape spilled across tables like paper serpents. Blackboards were crowded with columns of meaningless letters, smudged equations, and half-erased guesses. The air hung thick with tobacco smoke and fatigue. A dozen cryptanalysts hunched over their desks, pencils tapping in rhythm with the teleprinters that clattered endlessly in the corner. Flowers said nothing for a moment. He simply watched. Then he murmured, "You're doing all this by hand?" A codebreaker looked up, irritated. "How else would we do it?" "By letting something faster think for us," Flowers replied. He wasn't a mathematician or a soldier. He was an engineer from the post office research station at Dollis Hill, a man who spent his life coaxing unreliable vacuum tubes into obedience. While others saw valves as fragile glass things that burned out for fun, he saw logic, the potential for electronic thought. The officers at Bletchley showed him their new problem, a monstrous cipher used for Hitler's own top-level communications, the Lorenz code, or Tunny, as they called it. It wasn't like Enigma. It was far more complex, created by 12 rotating wheels generating billions of combinations. The British had already uncovered parts of its structure thanks to a mathematical prodigy named Bill Tute, but actually testing the possible wheel settings would take humans months. Flowers studied the endless sheets of figures, the weary eyes of men who hadn't seen sleep in days. "What if," he said quietly, "a machine could do the work?" They stared at him. Someone laughed. "A machine? With valves? It'd burn out before breakfast." "Not if you keep it warm," Flowers said. "Valves fail when they're switched on and off. Leave them running, and they'll live longer than we will." He began sketching an idea on the back of a telegram, a device that would read teleprinter tape with a photoelectric sensor and compare streams of data at electronic speed. No wheels, no cranks, just pulses of light and electricity. A machine that could test patterns thousands of times faster than any human. When he proposed building it, Bletchley's command hesitated. It was too radical, too expensive, too unproven. So Flowers did something unheard of in wartime Britain. He built it himself. He borrowed parts from the post office, smuggled resistors in his coat pockets, and spent his own savings to buy materials. At night, he biked home through blackout London, pockets full of schematics, while the city burned under German bombs. During the day, he and his small team at Dollis Hill soldered, drilled, and wired until their fingers bled. The prototype, nicknamed Heath Robinson, was half mechanical, half electronic. It worked sometimes, but it jammed more often than it ran. Flowers stared at it, jaw clenched. "We'll do it again," he said. "No moving parts this time." What he built next would change the world. By the winter of 1943, the machine had a name, Colossus. It stood taller than a man and weighed 5 tons. More than 2,000 valves glowed inside its steel frame, pulsing like a living organism. Paper tape streamed through at 40 miles an hour, the light from the reader flashing like a heartbeat. Flowers knew every sound it made, the hum of transformers, the faint hiss of current through wires. When it purred, it was happy. When it buzzed, something was wrong. He called it his electronic brain, though no one else dared use the term. Bletchley officials still doubted him. They feared the valves would fail, that the machine would overheat or explode. But Flowers had faith in his design. "You can't ask a man to fight numbers with pencils," he told them. "You need something that thinks in sparks." In January 1944, Colossus was finally loaded onto trucks and delivered under armed guard to Bletchley Park. The men watched in silence as it was assembled piece by piece, its wires snaking across the floor like veins. The first test came at midnight. The hut was cold, frost fogged the windows. Flowers stood at the control panel, one hand on the switch. "If this doesn't work," someone whispered, "what happens next?" Flowers smiled faintly. "Then we go back to pencils." He pulled the lever. The machine came to life with a low hum, lamps flickering into a soft orange glow. The paper tape began to move, flickering through the reader at impossible speed. Counters clicked, relays ticked, and then silence. A red light blinked. On the front panel, a dial spun once and stopped. One of the analysts leaned in, heart hammering. "It's found something," he said. The room stayed silent for a long moment. Then someone laughed, a short, unbelieving sound, and another joined in. The laughter grew, breaking through weeks of exhaustion. Colossus had cracked the first tunny key. Outside, the wind swept across the dark English fields. Inside, a handful of men and women watched the world's first true electronic computer breathe for the first time. It wasn't beautiful, not yet. It was hot, loud, and stubborn, but it worked. And as the machine's glow filled the hut, Tommy Flowers simply stood there, his face lit by the valves he'd refused to doubt. He'd built something that could think faster than any human. Something that would help end the war. Something that, though no one yet understood it, had just changed the future forever. The first time Colossus truly came to life, the room itself seemed to hold its breath. It was the night of January 28, 1944. Frost lined the windows of Hut 11B. The blackout curtains quivered from the hum of generators outside. Inside, a faint orange glow from thousands of vacuum tubes flickered like the pulse of something alive. Tommy Flowers stood at the control panel, sleeves rolled up, his hands blackened with oil and solder. Beside him was Bill Tute, pale, exhausted, but alert. Around them, a small group of engineers and Wrens waited in silence. For months, they had worked toward this moment, the first real test of an electronic machine built not to kill, but to think. Flowers took a breath and flipped the main switch. The room filled with a deep, steady hum. Paper tape began to unspool through the reader, flickering under a beam of light. Thousands of holes flashed past the photoelectric sensor each second. The counters clicked, relays chattered, and the machine, 5 tons of metal and glass, started to calculate. Someone whispered, "She's breathing." They all felt it. For years, the cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park had fought an invisible war against the Lorenz cipher, the code used for Hitler's most secret communications. Each message contained orders for entire fronts, sent from the Reich Chancellery to generals across Europe. Cracking even one could change the course of battle. But the cipher, generated by 12 mechanical wheels, had more combinations than there were atoms on Earth. Before Colossus, humans tried to solve it by hand. Long hours of pencil marks and probability charts, each calculation taking minutes, sometimes hours. By the time a message was deciphered, the war it described was already over. Now, that changed. Colossus could read 5,000 characters per second. She compared intercepted signals against virtual wheel patterns, searching for statistical correlations invisible to the human brain. She didn't understand language, but she understood rhythm, the heartbeat of encrypted thought. At first, the results were nonsense. A fuse blew. One of the valves overheated and died. Flowers calmly replaced it, wiped his hands, and tried again. Hour after hour, they fed in new tapes. Then, at 3:03 a.m., something shifted. The rows of counters froze. The tape stopped. Tute leaned in, holding his breath. "Look," he said softly. "That's it." On the output strip, one number repeated in a perfect pattern, too precise to be random. Colossus had found the day's key. For the first time in history, a machine, not a man, had broken a military code. By dawn, a decrypted Lorenz message sat on Winston Churchill's desk. It revealed German plans on the Eastern Front, troop withdrawals, fuel shortages, hints of desperation. Churchill circled one phrase in red pencil and wrote in the margin, "Actionable." But in Bletchley, there was no celebration. Flowers simply exhaled, wiped condensation from the control panel, and said, "She works." Then they started again. From that night forward, Colossus never slept. She ran almost constantly, her lights blinking through the small hours while the operators, mostly young women from the Women's Royal Naval Service, fed her tapes, logged results, and fixed her temperamental circuits. They nicknamed her the Giant, but some called her She, as if she were a living being. "She's moody today," one operator would say when a counter jammed. "Give her a minute." Despite the secrecy, a quiet affection grew around the machine. The Wrens brought tea into the room at midnight, speaking in whispers, afraid to break her concentration. Flowers, usually silent, would occasionally murmur encouragement under his breath, as though talking to a restless child. The data Colossus produced flowed straight to the highest command. Her decrypts revealed the placement of German panzer divisions, fuel depots, and troop convoys, information that shaped bombing raids and saved thousands of lives. Each new discovery meant hours of sleepless work and mountains of paper. But not everyone could know. The project was so secret that even most of Bletchley Park had no idea it existed. Its operators needed 3 separate passes to enter the hut. Flower's name appeared on no official document. To the world, Colossus did not exist. And yet, she was everywhere, in the unseen hand guiding Allied strategy, in the quiet corrections made to Churchill's maps, in the coded orders that crossed the Atlantic. By June 1944, as the Allies prepared for D-Day, 10 Colossus machines were running day and night. Their calculations confirmed that German forces remained stationed around Calais, fooled by the fake signals of Operation Fortitude. Eisenhower's invasion force could strike at Normandy with confidence. The most secret weapon of the war wasn't a bomb or a plane. It was a room filled with light and the steady hum of a machine that thought faster than any human alive. Sometimes, in the brief silence between tape runs, one of the operators would look at the glowing panels and whisper, "She's still awake." And Tommy Flowers, standing nearby, would nod slowly. Because as long as Colossus kept breathing, that soft electrical sigh of glass and wire, the Allies still had their edge. But none of them yet knew that when the war ended, everything they had built would have to disappear, buried beneath official secrets, as if it had never existed at all. And the machine that changed history would be silenced by the very victory it had helped create. June 5, 1944. Over the English Channel, thunder rolled like artillery. Lightning flashed against waves whipped white by wind. Along the coast, ships strained at anchor, engines idled. Thousands waited for a word that hadn't yet come. But in a locked hut at Bletchley Park, another storm was already breaking, one made of static, paper tape, and the restless hum of a machine that never slept. Colossus was alive. Rows of valves glowed orange in the dark. Paper streamed through her reader faster than the eye could follow. Each hole in the tape was a whisper from Berlin, orders, doubts, coordinates, the private voice of Hitler's war machine. Operators bent over consoles, their faces ghosted by the light. One message flickered into clarity, main effort expected at Pas-de-Calais. Another followed, no immediate redeployment south. Bill Tutte circled the words in pencil. "They believe it," he said. That single sentence changed history. For weeks, the Allies had built an illusion. Fake armies, false radio chatter, cardboard tanks scattered across southern England. Now Colossus confirmed it had worked. The Germans expected the invasion at Calais, not Normandy. The deception was perfect. Outside, General Eisenhower wrestled with the weather. The channel boiled with wind, visibility near zero. Advisors urged delay. The meteorologists hesitated. Then came the forecast, a narrow window, 24 hours of calm before the next storm. Eisenhower looked up from the map and said simply, "We go." At that same moment, in Bletchley, Colossus kept reading. Line after line of Loren's messages scrolled from the printer, each one proof that the enemy was blind. Flowers and Tutte barely spoke. The air smelled of metal and sweat. Somewhere in the room, an officer murmured, "We fight with digits, not bullets." Just after midnight, the first paratroopers crossed the coast. Colossus kept working. At 2 a.m., a decrypted message arrived from a German command post near Paris. Allied landing reported. Believed to be diversionary. Tutte smiled faintly. "They still think it's Calais." Rain beat against the windows. The operators wiped condensation from the panels and fed new rolls of tape. The machine ran like a living thing, breathing in signals, exhaling certainty. Each printout was another heartbeat in a war fought by wires. By dawn, reports from Normandy reached London. Beaches secured, losses heavy, but the landings held. Still, no German divisions moved south. Hitler, convinced the real attack was yet to come, refused to release the panzer reserves near Calais. Hours became days. The Allies dug in. The deception held. At Bletchley, no one celebrated. Flowers leaned over the machine, checking voltages, his face streaked with exhaustion. A young Wren handed him a note from a liaison officer, its corners smudged with rain. "You've just won us the sea." He folded it once and slipped it into his pocket. "Keep her running," he said. All through June 6th, Colossus tracked every movement of the German command network. Each decoded message confirmed the same truth. The invasion was working because the enemy still believed the lie. Every number, every pulse of light, was another life saved on the beaches. When the first reports of success reached Eisenhower's headquarters, cheers broke out. Men shouted, embraced, prayed. In Bletchley, there was only the steady click of relays. A Wren turned to another and whispered, "Do you think they'll ever know what she did?" The other shook her head. "They can't." Late that night, with the battle turning in Normandy's favor, the shift supervisor gave the final order: power down. One by one, the valves dimmed. The hum faded into silence. The air cooled. The room that had changed the course of the war sank into darkness. Above ground, generals toasted victory. Below, the machine that had made it possible fell still. Colossus had done her work, and already, whispers were starting. Orders. Files. Secrets. Soon, someone would decide that she, too, must disappear. Autumn, 1945. The war was over. Berlin had fallen, and the world began to count its dead. Across Europe, people stepped from ruins into silence, unsure what to build first, homes or memories. In London, beneath the rain-streaked windows of the War Office, a single envelope moved from desk to desk. It was stamped in red, "Top Secret, Destroy." Inside Bletchley Park, Hut 11B still smelled of dust and warm metal. The machines had been silent for months, their valves cold, their tape reels still. Tommy Flowers returned one last time to check the wiring. He moved quietly between the hulking frames, touching the steel as though it were skin. The message had arrived that morning. All Colossus units to be dismantled immediately. Components to be destroyed without record. He stood for a long while, reading the order. The words were short, bureaucratic, but final, the kind of command that ends not just a project, but a life's purpose. When Flowers asked why, a colonel simply said, "The war is done. No one must know how we won it." That night, engineers who had once built Colossus began to take her apart. Wires were cut, panels unscrewed, lamps unsocketed one by one. The great machine that had broken Hitler's most secret code, that had whispered the truth of Normandy into Allied ears, was dismantled in silence. A few of the Wrens cried. Others worked with blank faces, pretending it was just another maintenance shift. The clatter of wrenches and the hiss of solder echoed through the hut like a slow heartbeat dying. When the last section of frame collapsed onto the floor, Flowers stepped forward and picked up one of the glass valves. It was still warm from the previous day's test. He turned it in his hand until the filament glowed faintly, then slipped it into his pocket. No one stopped him. By dawn, crates of scrap metal and tangled wires filled the yard. A lorry backed up to the hut. Soldiers loaded the remains without speaking. The order was clear: no record, no photographs, no trace. What could not be reused was burned. From a distance, the smoke looked ordinary, the color of wet paper and burnt dust. But to those who had spent years inside that hut, it was the color of forgetting. When it was over, Flowers returned to his small flat in East London. His wife asked what was wrong. He just said, "Work's finished." For weeks, he barely spoke. He went back to his old job at the post office research station, repairing telephone exchanges and designing circuits that no one would remember. He was forbidden to talk about Colossus, not to his colleagues, not to his family, not even to the men who had fought for the freedom it helped secure. When one official report about wartime technology listed electronic computers of future potential, his name wasn't there. In fact, no one's was. The word Colossus was erased. One of the engineers later recalled. He'd sit at his desk, staring at nothing. Once he said, "She was smarter than any of us." And we killed her. In the years that followed, new machines appeared. ENIAC in America, UNIVAC, Ferranti. Newspapers called them the first computers in history. Flowers read the headlines, folded the paper, and said nothing. He couldn't. The Official Secrets Act still bound him tighter than any chain. Meanwhile, in laboratories across the Atlantic, men received awards, patents, and honors for inventions that Colossus had already achieved in secret. No one in Britain could correct them. No one dared. As the atomic age dawned, the world looked to bombs, not circuits. Power meant destruction again. The quiet war of the codebreakers vanished into locked archives and classified ledgers. Even at Bletchley, the huts decayed. Grass grew through the floorboards where once the hum of computation had filled the air. One evening in 1948, Flowers took the last surviving circuit diagram from his desk drawer. He'd copied it from memory, every resistor, every valve, every cable. For a moment, he considered burning it, as he'd been ordered to years ago. Instead, he slid it back into an envelope marked private and sealed it with tape. Someday, he murmured, they'll want to know. He didn't know it would take 30 years. The next morning, he went to work as usual. On the way, he passed a newsstand. A headline caught his eye. The future is electronic. America leads the way. Flowers stopped, stared at it, and gave a small, tired smile. Maybe, he whispered. But the future started here. Behind him, London buses roared, and the world moved on. Too busy to notice that in a small brick hut, the first computer to ever think had already been erased, piece by piece, by the hands that had built it. Above Bletchley, the fields were green again. Birds nested in the rafters where once wires had hung. But sometimes, on damp mornings, the air still smelled faintly of burnt paper and hot metal, like the breath of a ghost. The Ghost of Colossus. 1975. In a forgotten corner of the British Public Records Office, a young historian named James Ellis brushed the dust from a thick brown envelope. The label was fading, typed in wartime ink. Colossus, top secret. No one had requested it in 30 years. He expected another dull folder of supply lists or radio maintenance logs. But when he broke the seal, his hands began to shake. Inside were diagrams, thousands of tiny circles, valves, logic gates, arrows marked input and output. At the top of one page, written in blue pencil, designed by T.H. Flowers, 1943. He didn't know it yet, but he'd just opened the door to a secret that would rewrite the history of computing and the Second World War itself. Across Britain, the government had begun to relax wartime secrecy laws. Projects buried under the Official Secrets Act were slowly being declassified. Historians pored over files with disbelief. Decrypts labeled Ultra, maps with notes from Churchill's private office, cables between Eisenhower and London marked Eyes Only. But none of it compared to Colossus. Ellis took the documents to his supervisor, who stared in silence, then whispered, "This shouldn't exist." Within weeks, the files reached the BBC. The headline on the Times read, "Secret British computer broke Hitler's code before ENIAC." The public reaction was immediate: confusion, pride, outrage. In America, scientists who had built the post-war computers refused to believe it. Impossible, one said. You can't build a programmable machine with valves in 1943. But the photos proved it. The banks of switches, the endless reels of tape, the human figures dwarfed by machinery that glowed like an early sunrise. Bletchley Park, long abandoned and half in ruins, became a pilgrimage site overnight. Journalists arrived, stepping over cracked tiles and ivy to reach the huts. One of them found an old tag still nailed to a doorframe, 11B, Colossus Room. The paint had faded, but the word was still legible. And then, someone found Tommy Flowers. He was 71, retired, living quietly in East London. When the reporters came, he answered the door himself, wiping grease from his hands. In his small workshop were the remains of a radio and a half-built clock. They asked him, "Are you the man who built Colossus?" He hesitated. Then, almost shyly, he said, "Yes, though I never thought anyone would care." For hours they spoke while his kettle hissed on the stove. He told them how he'd mortgaged his house to buy parts the government wouldn't fund, how he'd soldered each valve by hand, how the first time Colossus lit up, it felt like a new creature learning to breathe. When they asked why he'd never spoken of it, he smiled sadly. They told us it was secret forever. You don't question forever. The next week, newspapers around the world printed his face beside the headline. The man who built the first computer. But Flowers didn't read them. He'd seen enough of headlines. At Bletchley, former Wrens and engineers reunited for the first time since the war. Gray-haired women who once typed in the cold now stood inside the echoing ruins, touching the walls as if greeting a friend. One of them whispered, "We kept the world alive, and nobody knew." In universities from Cambridge to California, computer scientists studied the newly declassified blueprints. They realized what few had believed possible, that Colossus had used parallel processing, electronic logic, even error correction. She wasn't just a codebreaker. She was the ancestor of everything that came after. But for all the glory of the revelation, there was bitterness too. In the official histories of computing, Britain's contribution had already been erased. ENIAC and IBM filled the textbooks. Flowers' name appeared nowhere. "We built the first," said one veteran. But America built the story. Still, there was a quiet satisfaction among those who had been there. They'd carried their secret for decades, through marriages, funerals, and peace. Now the world finally knew. One autumn afternoon, a BBC crew filmed Flowers walking through what remained of HUD 11B. The floor was warped, the air cold and damp. He paused where Colossus had once stood, a shadowed rectangle on the wooden boards, and placed his hand over it. "She never thought," he said softly. "Not like we do, but she helped us save what thinking really means." For a moment, the microphones picked up only the wind through the broken window. Then he added, "I wasn't trying to invent the future. I just wanted our boys to come home." The footage aired that winter, part of a documentary called The Machine That Won the War. Millions watched. Letters poured in from across the world, school children, scientists, veterans. Some called him a genius. Others simply wrote, "Thank you." But when one journalist asked where the original Colossus was kept, Flowers answered with the same quiet honesty he'd given his machine 3 decades earlier. "She's gone. We destroyed her. Every bolt, every lamp. All that's left is memory." It was true. The physical machine no longer existed, but her ghost had returned. Engineers began to dream aloud of rebuilding her. Museums requested access to the drawings. For the first time since 1945, the name Colossus was spoken not in whispers, but with reverence. And somewhere deep in the British archives, where the air still smelled faintly of paper and dust, a reel of punched tape waited. The heartbeat of a giant, patient as history itself, ready to be heard again. Because the world finally remembered what it had once decided to forget. Today, in the quiet halls of Bletchley Park, visitors stop in front of a glass wall. Behind it, valves glow softly. Paper tape streams through a reader with the same rhythm it had 80 years ago. The rebuilt Colossus hums, alive again. A machine born in war, resurrected in peace. It took nearly 2 decades of work. Engineers, historians, and retired veterans pieced her together from fragments. A blurred photograph here, a smudged schematic there, and the fading memories of those who had once stood beside her. No complete blueprint existed. Every wire had to be guessed, every connection tested by instinct and faith. "We weren't restoring a machine," one engineer said. "We were trying to remember an idea." When the replica was finally switched on in 1996, a faint electrical scent filled the room. Warm dust, hot copper, something ancient awakening. The valves flickered uncertainly, then steadied into a steady pulse. Lines of numbers printed onto paper, the sound sharp and familiar. An old Wren, one of the original operators, covered her mouth and whispered, "That's her heartbeat." The audience clapped, but most stood in silence. The room wasn't filled with triumph, it was reverence. For years, Colossus had existed only as rumor, a ghost of a secret war. Now, she stood again, not to save lives, but to remind humanity what it was capable of when it fought with intellect instead of hate. The rebuilt Colossus wasn't perfect. Some circuits had to be guessed. A few valves came from scrapyards or forgotten university storerooms. Yet when she began processing a Lorenz message, one of the originals from 1944, the output matched the decrypted text from the archives exactly. The engineers laughed, some cried. The ghost of the war machine had found her voice again. Visitors often asked the guides, could she really think? The guides always answer the same. She didn't think like us. but she helped us remember how to. In one corner of the exhibit stands a small plaque. Tommy Flowers, 1905 to 1998. He believed that a machine could think faster than any man, and proved that a machine could help man think more humanly. Flowers lived just long enough to see the replica completed. When the team invited him to the unveiling, he walked slowly to the front row, his suit slightly too big, his hands trembling. When the lights dimmed and Colossus came alive again, he smiled faintly. "She looks well," he said. "Better than the last time I saw her." A reporter asked him what it felt like to see his creation reborn after half a century. He thought for a moment before replying. "It's not mine anymore. It belongs to history." The story of Colossus spread across the world. Schools taught her as the ancestor of every computer, the spark that lit the digital age. Universities wrote papers comparing her logic circuits to modern processors. But those who worked at Bletchley knew it was more than technology. It was a philosophy. Colossus was built not to kill, but to understand. In a war of bombs and blood, she fought with reason. She turned chaos into patterns, fear into knowledge. Every pulse of her valves was a defiance of brutality, proof that even in the darkest moment of the 20th century, intelligence was the sharpest weapon humanity possessed. Now, in the museum's twilight hours, when the crowds have gone, the hum of Colossus fills the empty hall. The staff say the sound changes with the weather, louder on rainy days, softer in winter. It's probably just the old circuitry, but one archivist swears she can hear words in the noise, fragments of the past, messages half erased by time. Sometimes schoolchildren press their hands against the glass, watching the numbers roll by on paper tape. They see only a relic, but behind it lies everything they touch today, every phone, every computer, every circuit that remembers how to think. Before closing each night, the curator performs a quiet ritual. She walks to the control console, flips one switch, and watches the lamps fade one by one until the room darkens. The last light always lingers, a single orange valve glowing stubbornly, as if refusing to let the past go. Only when it dims does she whisper, "Good night, old girl." Because Colossus was never just a machine. She was a mirror, one that showed what humanity could do when it chose logic over fear, creation over destruction. Tommy Flowers once said, "Colossus didn't win the war alone, but she taught us that thinking, real, careful thinking, could." And that, perhaps, is her greatest legacy. When people leave Bletchley Park, they often glance back through the glass. The machine stands quiet, motionless, but it feels alive, the first spark of the modern world, still glowing faintly beneath the dust of time. War built her. Silence buried her. Memory revived her. And as her valves rest in the dark, it's hard not to believe she still remembers the moment when light returned to the world. Because Colossus was made to break the code of war. But in the end, she broke the code of what it meant to be human.